Boom. All right. It says we are now live. So hold on, let me hit record. I'm just glad I've remembered each time. All right. Here we go.
Right. We are live. Well, welcome everybody to our next installment of Theocon, Theology in a Time of Crisis. I am Sarah Lane Ritchie, coming to you from the University of Edinburgh. I'm here with my colleague tonight, as usual, Trip Fuller, and we are joining you late at night at our time here in Scotland, and maybe where you are in the world a little bit earlier. We're delighted to have you with us this evening. We are going to be discussing theological ethics, and we have some powerhouse guests with us this evening that we are very excited about. If you have not had a chance to watch the talks, the recorded talks that are the centerpiece of this evening's discussion, stick around, don't leave, hang out for the discussion, and then as soon as we're done, go watch the talks because gosh, they are amazing and they are worth it. And we're very excited about the conversation this evening. We are not going to be short of anything to talk about. So as usual, the idea tonight is that we will be using the recorded talks as a launch point to enter into discussion with you all. So please do feel free to send us questions or comments that you'd like to be discussed. You can do that on any of the platforms. If you're on the Zoom call, you can send those in as well in the Q&A section, and we will get to as many of them as we can in the discussion portion of the evening. So without saying much else, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guests this evening, and then we will turn it over to them to give some brief summaries of their talks, and we'll kick things off. So first up, we have Gary Dorian. Professor Dorian is the Reinhold Niebuhr Professor of Social Ethics at Union Theological Seminary and Professor of Religion at Columbia University. He's the author of 20 books and more than 300 articles that range across the fields of social ethics, philosophy, theology, political economics, social and political theory, religious history, cultural criticism, and intellectual history. Cornel West has described him as, quote, the preeminent social ethicist in North America today. Philosopher Robert Neville calls him, quote, the most rigorous theological historian of our time, moving from analyses of social context and personal struggles to the most abstruse theological and metaphysical issues. If you're familiar with Professor Dorian's work, you will be very familiar with the accuracy of these quotes. I love Gary's self-description here that he gave to an interviewer, which says, I am a jock who began as a solidarity activist, became an Episcopal cleric at 30, became an academic at 35, and never quite settled on a field. So now I explore the intersections of too many fields. Many of us would fit that description, I think, and I love it. Notably for today's conversation, in 2018, Gary won the Choice Award of the American Library Association for his book, Breaking White Supremacy, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Black Social Gospel. He also has a trilogy that many of you will be aware of called The Making of American Liberal Theology, which is considered by anyone familiar with the subject matter to be both definitive and authoritative in the field. Gary's most recent book is Social Democracy in the Making, Political and Religious Roots of European Socialism, published in 2019. And then he also has a book coming out this year, 2020, I believe, called In a Post-Hegelian Spirit, Philosophical Theology as Idealistic Discontent. And also very appropriately for this evening, he's currently completing a book on the history of American democratic socialism. Next up, we have Adam Clark. Adam is the Associate Professor of Theology at Xavier University. And he is committed to the idea that theological education in the 21st century must function as counterstory, one that equips students to read against the grain of the dominant culture and inspires them to live into the Ignatian dictum of going forth to set the world on fire. To this end, Dr. Clark is intentional about pedagogical practices that raise critical consciousness by going beneath surface meanings, unmasking conventional wisdoms, and reimagining the good. He has received many distinctions in teaching in particular, including Teacher of the Year nomination by um, the Alpha Sigma Nu International Honor Society and the Faculty Support Award by the Black Student Association. His courses on Black theology, Jesus and power, faith and justice, and religion and hip hop contribute to the Jesuit practice of educating students in the service of faith and the promotion of justice. He currently serves as co-chair of the Black Theology Group at the American Academy of Religion, actively publishes in the area of Black theology and Black religion, and participates in social justice groups at Xavier and in the Cincinnati, Ohio area. And last but not least, we have Helene Russell, who is the Associate Professor of Theology at Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis, I believe, where she's been since 2002. She graduated from Ohio Wesleyan University with a degree in religion and philosophy, and then a master's in theological studies from the School of Theology in Claremont, California, and did her PhD in the philosophy of religion and theology from Claremont Graduate School. Helene has published a book entitled The Pluralism Within, a Reconstruction of Theological Anthropology, which is based on Soren Kierkegaard and Luce Irigaray. I'm sorry, I'm slaughtering that. In 2010, and she has edited Creating Women's Theology, a movement engaging process thought, and has also co-edited a recent volume entitled Augustine and Kierkegaard. The project she's currently undertaking explores the interface between theology, yoga, and embodied spirituality, and she seeks to write a trauma-sensitive theology. Other research interests include process feminist theology and ecological spirituality. So we have some very accomplished and diverse individuals with us tonight. So without saying anything else, I think I will go ahead and turn it over first to Gary and then to Adam to give just a brief summary of your main talks for those who may have not had a chance to tune in and watch them yet. So Gary, go for it.
Thank you, Sarah. And thanks to Sarah and Tripp for this invitation. I was delighted to be invited. I am mortified to say that I didn't know Sarah's last name until today. And so right out of the box in this talk I give, I make my first mistake, and it's the one that I'm just having a very hard time living with now. There are others to come in this talk, but I don't feel so badly about those. So there's a series on theology in a time of crisis, and there have been other series of this sort. I've contributed to them, but in the past, you always knew which crisis it is that you were being assigned. And this time, that was my first issue, is just of these many crises that are part of this crisis we are in now. Which one should I even go for? And I thought through variations of this talk before submitting the one that I did. And then later, I had to redo it even afterwards, after we lost George Floyd. And now I've got to redo it yet again. So that itself became an example of the problem itself, of just picking how it is you're going to try to wrap your arms around whatever the crisis is that you're trying to describe. And in the midst of all that swirling around and deciding and redeciding what I was even going to talk about for this talk, I did end up deciding to go for two things that in some ways don't quite fit the crisis mode, only because they are so permanent, because they're so long-standing and so fundamental to the US American experience that even talking about the crises of anti-Black racism and the crisis of economic injustice in the US are just so fundamentally defining for the field that I teach, for just everything that I think about and care about, that I thought, well, these at least are different than these other crises that I rolled through pretty quickly in the first paragraph of this talk. So I went for these two things that are more like a permanent crisis, more like a condition, that are very much in and underneath these other crises that we have, including the health crisis that we are all being buffeted by. But I did decided to go for those two things, and more specifically, not just racism, but anti-Black racism, especially in the U.S. American context, and then not just vaguely about economic justice, but really about democratic socialism per se. So there's a fair amount of socialist theory and sort of analysis in this talk that I gave. And then there's the question of context. And so that I also, not even knowing for sure why it is that we're coming out of the University of Edinburgh, or what this English connection is, or even what the audience is, I thought, I'll do some sort of US and British connection here. So this is actually a talk with a fourfold frame, wrapped all in crisis, but it's about the crisis of anti-Black racism in the United States and in the world, and the crisis of economic justice in the United States and especially in England, and then the linkage between Christian socialism in those two contexts, that is, the Christian socialism in the United States and in Britain. And I do go a little bit long on that part of the talk with regard to the British context. And one of the things that's showing through here is just that I did just write these two big books on democratic socialism. So my head is just sort of brimming with it. Although it's now a month and a half removed, from when I gave this talk. So I've actually acquired a little bit of distance now from the American book, which will come out next year. But those are the four things that are in here. And the regret I have, besides the mistakes I made, is just that there is, when you pick this many topics, there is the problem of then just getting different things sort of marshaled together into a talk, and a certain amount of kind of strip mining from the top, that you haven't really gone too much into anything because you're just so concerned to get them all in play here. And so that happened with all four of these issues, except for went a little bit longer on democratic socialist history and theory. And that's because there's all of this, so much of what's thought or known about this subject, I think, is not quite right, or it sort of needs to be nuanced or kind of set straight. So there's a fair amount of that going on in this talk as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Adam, would you like to give a synopsis of your talk?
Sure. And I'd like to also thank Sarah and Tripp for the invite. And I enjoyed Gary's talk, learned a lot, did a deep dive into socialism, and that was very helpful. I learned about a lot of figures who I had heard about just in reference, but not to the depth, and started Googling after I would hear him talk more in depth about that. So I very much enjoyed that. My talk centered mostly out of my activism and my kind of conversations with local pastors on the ground in reaction to the protests. So I'm in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I was working with a lot of pastors and leaders who saw the protests, but weren't sure how to engage the protests. So I started looking at the Black Lives Matter movement the way liberation theologians looked at political movements of the 1960s and 70s, the way James Cone looked at the Black Power movement and the Civil Rights movement, the way Latin American theologians looked at the base communities of Latin America, the feminist movements of the 1970s, the gay, now queer liberation movements, and really wanted to ask, can these be seen as a theological resource, right? Because what was happening is that many pastors were, even if they were sympathetic, saw them as kind of just political movements, but weren't able to discern, is anything new happening here? Can we discern the movement of God or the activity of God within these movements in the same way that liberationists did in the 1960s and 70s? And that's the question I really wanted to challenge. So on one hand, looking at it as a theological resource, and then also looking at, can Christian faith, as interpreted through the liberationist tradition, be an effective advocate for the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Because many people who are organizers and activists are very suspicious of the church and Christian faith. So I wanted to find some ways to demonstrate that theology can be a resource for the movement by deepening its moral vision, its moral imagination. Because so much of what liberationists and people on the left are united upon is what they're against, right? So a lot of people understand clearly what they're against: police violence, Trump, or any type of violation of dignity, but they're less confident on what they're for, what we're striving for, right? So I think there's some resources within the tradition to really try to give a clear, or kind of put a vision out there of not just a negative freedom, meaning what we're against, but a positive freedom of what we should be struggling for. And I think the Christian tradition can be utilized and mobilized in that way. And in addition to that, is that I also think the theological tradition at its best, I would say, also gives a vision of interconnectedness, so that when we talk about we're against violence against Black folks, it's not just state-sanctioned violence, right? There's an ecology of violence that happens in the Black community. So if we talk about a reverence for life, we're not just talking about the specific incidents of police versus protester or Black citizen violence. We're talking about the whole structure of violence, right? And one of the reasons that kind of motivated me to do this is because, I mean, this is kind of like the second or third incarnation of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I see a lot of interest when it's on TV and when the videos and when people are actually shedding blood in the street. So it becomes faddish, and then it dies down and people stop talking about racial justice with the passion that they did before. So what I tried to do is say, look, if we connect this to a dimension of faith and not just politics, meaning the prophetic, right, then this could be something that we talk about it as a theological or a faith-based conviction, not just part of your political preference, right? Because most people, pastors, were supporting it under the auspices of human rights or equality, not as a faith-based engagement. And I wanted to kind of put that together in a way that made sense. So when I talked about the prophetic, I talked about three dimensions. Three aspects. One is unsettling whiteness, or what does it mean to be prophetic today? One is unsettling whiteness. Two is connecting the rejected and criminalized body of Christ to rejected and criminalized bodies of today. And third is reimagining life together, right? So that's what I really tried to outline or scaffold, what it means to be prophetic in this historical moment.
Well, the talks were amazing. So everyone should go to theologycon.com and check them out if you haven't. That is an intense lure that I think, and the invitation to respond in the present, that dialectical invitation is something that ran across all the talks. Now, knowing how many resonances already existed between the two, and how excited Helene was in her text messages back and forth in discussing these, I'm going to avoid slipping into Baptist preacher mode and talking for a long time by just naming three connections and only one sermonic aside. And these are really elements that were connected in the two that I mostly just want y'all to talk with Helene about because it made me excited in my head. All right. So in both of your talks, you talk about how more is going on than, meets the mind, right? Like just what you think intellectually is not the only thing that's getting itself done in any moment. And there's a number of different analyses you can bring to it. But if democratic socialism is resisting a complete materialist analysis with the help of William Temple and Company, and if the analysis of white supremacy and racism isn't just attending to our cognition, but as Adam opens up his talk saying, maybe the anger in you is sacred And then later says, we have to address the precognition of racism, right? And if we're doing that, I would love, with Helene present as a processed feminist, to hear the intersectional reflections about how we attend to the affect of supremacy culture, especially for those that are community leaders and those of us that are teachers and parents and serving as leaders in different ways. What are ways we can attend to that? The second place of connection that ran through is that in both talks, you resisted an idea of redemption that kind of operates with the logic of the one, both, right? Like the perfect politician, or the I don't remember the number Gary gave, but about the different redemption models by neo-orthodoxy. I giggled when the line came up, and I suppose the ghost of Niebuhr doesn't haunt him, even if he makes neo-orthodoxy jokes. But but there was this connection that ran through the two that I wrote on a Post-it, so I believe it's that true, But if the normal mode of redemption in coming to these type of social crises is to hope for someone to act as one in this top-down interventionist theocratic king-style power, right? Like that if we are resisting that mode of redemption, the savior complex, you both offer visions of community where the entanglement of relations manifest the very interconnected materiality of God. The becoming of the many is a participatory invitation to a new type of relating, but you've always been that related. It's just the anticipation of the logic of the one misses it. And so whether the discussions around democratic power, the beloved community, the desire for a more inclusive beyond our tribal narrative, and all of them, I keep coming back to the debates that theologians have about how you render the kingdom of God most accurately in our contemporary context. And I know that every minister wrestles with it. So I thought that would be a fun place of coming up, because I think that picture of participatory democratic power, the invitation to the Abba-led kinship that Jesus gives, is going to resist putting a king in the kingdom, because hierarchy and patriarchy are intimately connected to white supremacy and that top-down logic. But as long as our prayer anticipates the intervention of the one, I wonder if we'll cultivate the vision of the multitude. And the last question, and I found this that ran through your talks, I almost wanted to line up the way you reflect on how we think about the past, be it in a kind of Whiteheadian and infused William Temple style Hegelianism, or the way we think about the past in dangerous memories. Because in all of it, the question is, or even in the transformations of socialist history, in all of it, the past is something we have to deal with, right? So part of the way supremacy culture and top-down logic and these type of things preserve themselves is rendering the past interpreted on an agenda. And so they're showing up to the past as a question. And then you all ask questions around the present. How do you deal with the crisis? How do you name it? How do you give it space to acknowledge the real ways it's connected? And those lead to how you think about the future. And one of the elements, and I know one of the questions dealt with this that was sent in advance, both of you imagine a God more invested in the becoming of the present than a lot of more liberal white Christians imagine. It's not a kind of a, functional deism or something, I think is the way the questioner put it. And so I wonder if we're setting aside the kind of savior vision of interventionist power God, how you relate to the past and the present, so that the community, the collective, comes to lean into the gift God is giving in the moment, or as the principle of possibility, or the future, or whatever. There are a number of different languages. And the last thing, was, and I know Adam mentioned this, that he went Googling. I can't find half of William Temple's stuff. And when Gary got done giving his description of the Whiteheadian modification of British, a version of Hegel, I just thought, I'm hanging out in the UK and he was an archbishop. So clearly I should go read half of his stuff real quick and just start mentioning him, because I don't think UK people are as allergic to archbishops as they are Alfred North Whitehead and Catherine Keller. So I was like, if I could just memorize random quotes of him and put it in my talks, they'll be like, well, I mean, he doesn't have as cool a sideburns as some of the former archbishops, but he'll go. So, and I know a couple people mentioned the same thing to me. So at some point I would not forget, like, starting point for William Temple, since you gave the most beautiful summary of a dual aspect monist vision of of, of a philosophical theology, this intimately connected, not only to philosophical project, which is what's exciting about it, but his philosophical theology is not locked in the logic of the 1%, but was reflecting on how you thought about economic policy and the life of the church. And that's really exciting to me. So with that, I want to hand things off to Helene and get ready for some fun.
Okay, well, that's great, Trip. I loved all the things that you said, and some of the things that I'm going to talk about, will sound a little bit familiar because they resonate with some of the ways that you're looking at the connections between these two great thinkers. That's you guys. So first of all, I want to thank you for this. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be able to be here and to, I'm still here in Indianapolis, but to be able to be with you via technology and to engage with Adam and with Gary. I see you both, I mean, you're both well-respected and well-spoken, and I loved the way that you put together both your passion and your ideas and shared them with us. And I see us as colleagues, not only as scholars, but also as religious leaders in the struggle toward the realization of what Adam refers to as the community of life. I love being able to participate in this conversation, and I've learned so much. I've learned about the experiences of African Americans that are in the midst of the protesting about the Black Lives Matter, and the wealth of theological resources that the history of American Christianity holds. I always learn so much whenever I hear Gary talk. Yes. I appreciate, Adam, your naming the multiple limbs of the prophetic tradition as not only criticizing the idolatry of white supremacy, and I love the way that you connected the pulling down of the monuments and the objection to those as the way that people respond when idols get torn down and they feel like their sacred is being violated in some way, making it very clear that Tillich would agree of the idolatry that's happening with some of the monuments to persons that have violated and stood for injustice and stood for white supremacy. And I love the way that, so you've got not only criticizing this idolatry of white supremacy, but also visualizing the suffering bodies of African American sons and daughters as Christ figures now in our midst, relying upon James Cone's great work, but also really grounding it and making it pertinent right now as to what's happening with all of the police brutality being seen by all of us, probably happening just as much previously, but not as visually present to us. And the trauma of that and how that trauma impacts us, but impacts our persons of color, not only those who have suffered from the actual experience of being brutalized by the police, but just viewing it and experiencing the connectedness of the community and the suffering of the community. So there's the criticizing, the visualizing, and then there's the energizing of our visions and our practices of living together. Seeing what the prophet does is energizes those visions. And so I appreciate that very much. I also appreciated the clarity with which, Gary, you articulate the connection between the economic systems of capitalism and the perpetuation of social and political structures that enable and support anti-Black racism and white supremacy. And how you call us to remember this history of both Black and white social gospel traditions and the movements toward democratic socialism that enable and support economic and political and social systems of equality and liberty for all persons. I particularly resonate with Gary's analysis of the recent push for universal healthcare as an example of the way that economic injustice plays into and supports and perpetuates systems of oppression. The prophetic critique offered by both Gary and Adam against white supremacy and its negative impacts upon African Americans reminds me also of the prophetic critiques given by feminists and womanist theorists and theologians. The dominant discourse and cognitive structures of our society are built upon sexism and phallocratic assumptions that are deeply embedded in our minds. As Alus Arigari says, phallocentric, there's phallocratic and phallocentric. So phallocentric discourse derives its power from its ability to eradicate differences and reduce all to the economy of the same. Pamela Lightsey sees gender binaries as problematic and that they have been transferred into racial binaries when society is divided into whites and persons of color. Multiplicities of identity, sexual identities, ethnic identities, any kind of identities that isn't the white male, straight white male, when we're aware of those multiplicities, this counters this dichotomy, this hierarchical dichotomy that lies at the base of our culture. And this reminds me of a concept that I utilize in teaching theology at Christian Theological Seminary, embedded theological assumptions. It's something that a lot of my colleagues say, oh, students are talking about embedded theological assumptions again. They must be taking a class from Helene. These, I'm sure you're all aware of the concepts, but these are biases. These are beliefs, values, habits that each of us harbors and often unaware. These biases blind us to the many abuses of power, especially when we identify as African American, as female or queer, or some way that doesn't fit the norm, the normative gaze, as Cornel West would say, because these assumptions are so deeply rooted within each of us. So even those who are not benefiting from them still have absorbed them and are affected negatively by them. They are so deeply rooted in all of us, they're like chemicals that are embedded in the flower bed that become part of our mental structure, even before we're self-conscious. And it takes a crisis. Pick one of the crises that we're having right now. And we also had a big storm of hail, which destroyed many of my friends and my boyfriend's garden. So we've just got crises everywhere. But it takes a crisis of pain and suffering to unearth these biases. I mean, how else are we going to change this? How can we become aware of these embedded assumptions? Because there's so much a part of us that we're not even aware that we have them. But it takes a crisis for us to see things differently, to unearth these biases so we can see them and examine them, and then we can make them conscious. And then we can maybe make moral decisions about them. our current crises of the COVID pandemic, the economic injustice, and police violence against African Americans, which, granted, only the COVID pandemic seems to be a crisis in the moment. The others are long-lasting, horrible ills, but we have become more aware of them, partially because of the COVID, but partially because of other factors that have made us more aware. It has broken our rose-colored glasses, or maybe our bleached glasses, so to speak, opening our eyes to see the pain and oppression of African Americans that has been rampant in American life, to make it present in our whole society, not just for those who are suffering. And while ethics demands that we rethink and restructure our social, economic, and political systems, as Gary and Adam so clearly lay out and visualize, our ethical reason and mental understanding is not enough to motivate us. This is only one way of knowing. And while it is an important information, it's still a surface way of knowing. Feminists have argued for a deeper and more comprehensive way of knowing, a formational way of knowing, one that realizes, makes effective, the interconnectedness of all persons, all creatures, and all of us who suffer. It reforms us, this new way of knowing that perhaps we're experiencing as we're participating in protests and as we're learning from those practices. This way of knowing is also transformational, hopefully creative transformation, as it opens our eyes, yes, and it opens our hearts, so that we are motivated not only by ethical righteousness, but also by the holy rage at injustice and by the passionate grace and love for each other. Sharon Welch reminds us that while we work toward this vision of this realm of God, the kingdom of God, this democratic socialism or beloved community or the community of life, we are wise to not tie our motivation to reason alone or to the results alone, but rather to the love and grace and anger that forms our very being. Our very beings as we are together, as we are becoming together. We resist injustice not merely because it is the right thing to do as dictated by ethical reason, but because it is essential to who we are. To not resist injustice, she says, is to risk our very heart and soul. Now, both Adam and Gary's presentations are seeping with this passion and with this anger and hope, a hope that blossoms from a deep formational knowing of our connectedness, of our internal relationality, and of the ubiquitous presence of God within each of us and beyond all of us. This hope is generated out of God's love, for it is love that motivates us to work to transform the structures of our society toward a community of life, where there is no need for prisons or police, because everyone has enough and no one has too much. And we all have health care.
Thank you very much, Helene. I now want to give our other speakers a chance to respond to these challenges and questions. I think actually, Adam, we'll start with you this time. If you are ready to give a response, if not, we can go on to Gary.
I mean, I can.
Go for it.
I'm not even sure what to respond. There was so much. It was so rich. Well, first of all, I appreciate the careful attentiveness that both Tripp and Elaine gave toward the talk. And they did a very good job at summarizing and highlighting the insights and the compatibilities with both of our talks. I guess my general response is really what I was thinking about is two things. How do we name the suffering? right? How do we name the suffering and how do we point toward hope, right? So in my thinking about this is that the suffering is not just, when Americans say racism, they usually think about individual meanness, right? And that's just not deep enough, right? So what I try to point to, again, I'm working with like a lot of pastors, is that whiteness is one of those powers and principalities in Ephesians that really threaten life and its flourishing. And it's got to be named that way, right? So to look at whiteness or racism, not just in terms of some type of personal animosity toward people of color, right? But as one of a kind of a driving force that's embedded in all things, right? So the proper response is more like kind of an exorcism to try to disentangle it from things, which is deep. When you think about it, it's deeper than what people will initially realize. It's not just looking at a specific act. And I think that's part of the mistake, especially in America, about looking at this, is they're trying to stop different acts or social attitudes that are uncivic. And I wanted to, thinking about it theologically, it's really about a term. You have to look at it in terms of evil, right? In terms of how it threatens life, right? And not just life of its initial victims, but life of the planet also. And that's where the community of life comes in, is that there's an interrelatedness that even people who are the primary agents are not realizing, right? So that's what the kind of fascinating multidimensionality of our crisis at this moment, where you have this kind of COVID crisis and this crisis, what I call kind of the virus 1619 and COVID-19, right? White supremacy 1619 and COVID-19 as two narratives that are kind of interlocking and interpenetrating, that are threatening human flourishing and human life and life on this planet. So that's the first thing. And also the very people who actually cheer the kind of destruction of kind of Confederate monuments and don't look at equal suspicion at white Jesuses or religious iconography in churches, right, are really having a partial vision, right? And I'm saying that the church has been more destructive than the Confederacy in terms of its kind of idolatry and its global impact on life in that way. So that was kind of the first prophetic moment, is that that the invitation of history is to look at us deeper. And then secondly, you know, if James Cone's The Cross in the Lynchy Tree is not evident now, I don't know when it ever will be, right? If you cannot see the relationship between the lynching of Jesus and the lynching of Black men in the street right now, I don't know if America will ever get it. Like that book, like to me, the George Floyd of 8 minutes and 46 seconds, right? Of having being asphyxiated, right? If that can't be likened to the asphyxiation of Jesus on the cross, right? As a center of your faith, I'm not sure if people will ever see it. If I was going to go longer in the paper, I would have talked about how aesthetics precedes ethics, meaning that one of the reasons why people can't see it is because their aesthetic lens prevents them from seeing it. So in another sense, if I was going to talk about the community of life, I would talk about the need for aesthetics and different framing stories, so that would make it more evident. And that's what I probably left out, or I didn't get a chance to fully articulate, is I talked about the ideal of the community of life, but I didn't talk about the framing stories that need to generate that form of consciousness in practice. So Christianity would need to reinvent itself in terms of looking at the kingdom in a different way and looking at its religious traditions. And also American history would have to reformulate itself too, about thinking about new stories it would tell. So I think this has an opportunity not just to be a movement of just minimal reforms, but a deeper structural change. And that's what my talk was trying to get to, or what are the levers that we need to identify to really foster deep structural change at a institutional level, both in church and society. And that's what the attempt was.
Thank you, Adam. Gary, let's move on to you.
Thank you, Sarah. I think I'll begin with 2 points that Adam has raised both in his paper and now in his response. And then once I run out of time, someone just tell me I'm done, right? So I'm just going to start on things here because I have way too much to say. Firstly, Adam just eloquently sort of evoked something about that. He says that there have been sort of 3 iterations of the Black Lives Matter movement already. And in this talk, he especially sort of evoked that sort of the feeling and even some of the history of that first one. That's when I was writing The New Abolition, and I'm in a church every single week during that period. This is just a sort of addition. I'm kind of morphing on something Adam said here. I remember vividly, just poignantly, what it was like in those churches who could see this going on, see its immense importance, and who felt left out by it and judged by it. And in some cases, some pretty hard things were said in certain locales where, you folks with the clerical collars aren't really welcome and with the like. And week after week, I'm in contexts where I'm in, white ecumenical churches or Black churches or ecumenical contexts where the two are trying to get together. And week after week, I would be saying, just folks, hang in there. This is not a movement that's actually anti-Christian. It's nothing like that. But we do have to see that the rules have changed. Your conventional assumptions about how you should function in the next such protest movement that you've been praying for years. Well, now it's here, but it isn't quite what you prayed for. And we just have, it's now for us to just show up and not have to be in charge and not claim that, our history is privileged or any such thing, regardless of even, here it was especially Black churches that often were just feeling a kind of hurt they're not willing to learn anything from us, and they say things about Martin Luther King that aren't true, etc. Right? That's what was going on that time. But I think what we've seen in the iterations since then is that is the case. Lots of church people have shown up. The churches have found ways of witnessing, of being present, of lending a voice that shows they don't have to be in charge, don't need to be the ones who always have the answer, even. And so I do think that is happening. We're in the middle of such a moment right now that it's hard to just get your arms around it. But I do think I know something about what's happened in the last 6 years, sort of leading up to it. Anyway, which goes to those iterations of something that, as Adam says, gets a lot of attention and then it tends to recede, and then it takes the next horrific series of acts before it becomes front and center again. Secondly, with all these sort of references to James Cone and his theology at Cross of the Lynching Tree, I guess I just need to say, yes, this speaks to Adam's point about that there needs to be something constructive here. And this was a big thing to Jim. This is why he was a theologian. And Jim was insistently a theologian. We got students to Union every year who would come and who really thought that, he really is just a Black nationalist with my kind of politics, whatever that is. And maybe he's really on his way to becoming an atheological atheist or something the way I am, that who were just insistent that must be who he really is. And boy, they would be surprised when they get it right between the eyes that no, he doubled down on theology fairly early in his career, and he is nothing if he's not a theologian. and a constructive one too. He put it on display when we did the last big AAR thing that he did when he was I was on with him, and Peter Paris was on that panel. And somebody said, "Are you going to, say anything that's hopeful?" Because apparently we had all been a little bit negative. And he gave me this look that said, "You better rattle on for a while here before I think of what I want to say." So I did. I rattled on for a while, and finally I got that look. Says, "Okay, I'm ready to speak." And when he spoke, he said, "Folks, we have a gospel. The gospel has something to say to us. Read Luke 4. Pay attention to it. Try to live up to it. Try to at least imagine what it would mean to live up to Luke 4. And that was it. He was done. He was leaving that crowd with just try to imagine actually taking the gospel seriously, right? But that was so constitutive to Cone in a way that people who just want to read it as kind of material for some kind of politics don't really, I think, get. With Tripp, there are a whole number of things here, including the ghost of Reinhold Niebuhr, but I need to lay off of all those things and just get to your last point, which had to do with the temple in Whitehead, and temple as a source for making Whitehead known, especially in his homeland. This was really important to me in my late 20s when I discovered Temple, since of course his name never came up in any course I ever took, or most of these books I read that filled my head with some kind of Hegelianism, but and Marxism, but Temple was never in the picture. But I finally found my way to a church. Didn't join a church till I was 28 years old, but did so. Hey, it was Temple's work, and it was just a consequence of, oh my goodness, here is someone who is a really creative theorist of economic democracy and of neo-Hegelianism, the two things that I thought only I sort of put together. And here is someone doing it, and doing it in a highly creative way while he's still, visiting 457 parishes in his diocese. And giving the Tripp asked for the reference. It's really the nature man and God, his magnificent Gifford lectures, when he is synthesizing Hegel and Whitehead like no one ever had, and in many respects no one ever has since, and doing it on his feet. Because it is him, he didn't have time to write it down yet. So it was those streams of thought and witness, and in a spiritually eloquent form that just radiated a certain spiritual sincerity. That's what made me think, well, okay, maybe I can be in his church, and it's totally something in my head, because, I have no acquaintance whatsoever with the Episcopal Church. I haven't begun to deal with its, certain other aspects of its history. I don't even know them yet. But if that was possible, then that was something that was possible for me too, and in which case it didn't even matter that he came from the other side of the mountain, as far as I was concerned, in terms of privilege and economic stature, and he grew up in castles, and his father was the Archbishop of Canterbury and all that. I'm as far from the opposite of that as you can get, and yet that didn't get in the way of seeing it, and it has surprised me ever since that Temple is so forgotten, because I did try to at least evoke something about what it is that I think in him is great. And I want to, lastly, when I was rattling on about my 4 parts of this talk and what's wrong about it and everything, what I'm really thinking the whole time I was rattling on is that in each one of those 4 things, there's a feminist critique of what happened and what needs to happen that I totally believe you should never leave aside. I mean, I just don't believe in it. That just as there's always the question about what sort of vantage point what does white supremacism do to this subject, it's just as much the case that privileging gender as a category of analysis is absolutely crucial, and you're just falsifying if you don't have it. And yet here I was furiously putting together a talk that just kept leaving it aside, and knowing I was doing it because I'm in a hurry to get my other 4 things going here. But the way that Helene so artfully sort of put together what, in a kind of gentle way, what's the difference that a feminist analysis makes, and just this sort of focus on relationality and sort of constructive aspect, I think it was quite beautiful. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you, all of you, for your contributions thus far. That's wonderful and gives us so much to talk about. We've got lots of questions from the audience that we can go to, and one that I'm going to start with. And so please just feel free to jump in wherever you want and argue with each other if you like as well. That's very cool with us. But one question that has been asked, and I'm going to pose it in an intentionally vague way, because I think it can be answered from a variety of disciplinary kind of perspectives, and also context within our current crises. So feel free to take this in any direction you like. Question is this moment of crisis that we're in, defined however you like to define it, an exception to Western civilization or a revelation of its true identity? So I will leave it up to you to jump in wherever you would like.
I would say both. First of all, I realized after Gary spoke that I didn't really address Tripp's question or Helene's question. So if you guys would like to restate anything, Trips were so like textured. It's so many different. He was asking one question, but having like 8 parts in it. So I'm not sure and I don't have anything to write things down here. I didn't bring my pen or pencil, so I wasn't able to keep chart. But if that likes to be the focus, but to answer the specific question that was asked, I see it as both. And let's get to, how was it framed again? It was like a revelation, and what was the other one?
Yeah. So the question is the current crisis, and this could be any of the crises that were discussed, is the current crisis an exception to Western civilization or a revelation of its true identity? Is it an exception to the rule, or are we seeing what's been there all along, or a natural organic outgrowth?
Oh, okay. I would say it's a revelation, right? But there's also novelty within the revelation, meaning that anti-Blackness is at the core of Western civilization. It's a structurally principle of Western civilization, right? And that part of what's happening when you see, let's just say, the Confederate monuments, right? And then you see in England, the slave trading monuments. And you see throughout Europe, as I mentioned in Belgium, King Leopold's statue going down, right? You see all of these things happening that really talks about, and statues are not just material things, it's really how society understands itself. So you see like actually getting to the root of Western self-understanding, right? And this thing happened in Minnesota, right? Over a police community conflict. And then all of a sudden you have people in Belgium knocking down King Leopold statues. So to me, it's really getting at something deep. And that's why I said dangerous memories. Dangerous memories of racial suffering are being grappled with throughout the West. That's actually revealing things about themselves. Even when you have Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben's, I mean, you have all the sports leagues that are actually, it reminds me of how when King and Montgomery in 1956, when they actually boycotted the bus, they could have never anticipated that a bus boycott would lead to the dismantling of racial segregation in the South. They saw it as a very local issue. And I mean, Gary could probably tell you more than anybody else about this, but they saw it as a local issue. They had no idea of the global ramifications of that act would happen. And I think the similar thing is happening now, right? So in one sense, it's revelatory, but it's not just a repetition, right? There's something new that's also happening. And I thought she said, I thought you meant that, you know, is there hope in this moment too, in terms of that? But there is, in terms of that history, there's an invitation in this, right? It's not just going back to revealing some type of structural evil. It's also a symbol of hope that the world is malleable in ways we didn't think, right? That history can be changed, the world can be changed. And I'm very impressed with the rapidity of the change in such a short period of time, right? I wouldn't have thought that NASCAR would have banned the Confederate flag, right? No one could have anticipated that. I wouldn't have thought that someone would paint Black Lives Matter outside of Trump Plaza, right? And outside the White House, right? So I'm saying that these things are symbols, but I think these symbols are revelatory of something deeper that's happening in the consciousness of folks, and these things going all around the world. So, I see this as both a revelation of something that is deeply constitutive of Western civilization, but I also see the promise that we could push things forward in a new way.
Yes, I'm grateful for this question. I too am a both and person. In fact, this is the first thing I went for in my talk, is just to say some things about crises that are of more recent origin, and some of them very pressing upon us. They've, look what COVID-19 has done to all of our lives. And yet, when I finally made the decision about which talk to give or how to put one together, I went for the two things that I think are permanent crises. Are just there from the beginning, there from 1492 onward, have always been there. You just can't have imperialism in its various iterations without the equation of color with inferiority, and just believing that it's all right. What we're doing is all right because they're inferior anyway, and they'll be better off if we bring our civilization to them and do whatever we do to them. I mean, that attitude is just all over the history of modern empire, including the more explicitly capitalist form that Hobson described, in which I went into a bit in the talk. And that, of course, is tied very deeply indeed to the economic justice argument, right? Just I can't you can pull them apart for purposes of some kind of analysis, but finally they're always intertwined. In the talk, I went a bit long on the second one, only because there's so much to talk about with regard to socialism, just what it is we're actually talking about, and sort of taking it apart and saying, what it has been historically, including just owning up. But there's democratic socialism itself has a very complicated and problematic history, which I barely touched in the talk. But what is so important to me about it is that it is at least theoretically always asking questions that have to be asked, and that do see the logic for everyone, right? That finally you're talking about something that isn't just, well, what national context are you in or the like. There's a universalizing aspect to the problem that democratic socialism is seeking to analyze and redress, that I think is always there and is utterly crucial. And having gone this far on that point, I want to say one more thing, which helps me to come back to Helene. And that is that one reason I go as long as I do on religious socialists in these books I've written on democratic socialism, that is the big one about Europe called Social Democracy in the Making, and then the one that's coming next year on American democratic socialism. I do go long on the history of religious socialism within democratic socialism. And I'm girded for reviewers who are going to say too much about religion, didn't want to hear about all these religious people, right? But one of the things that the religious movements that are there that have always been downgraded, that have never gotten their due in any of this literature that I read in order to write these books, one of the things they do is they open the way toward people of color, especially African Americans and women, who were in these movements that conventional histories don't get because they were religious. They came in through the social gospel. They came in through the Willard movement. They came in through movements that, it's for them, it began in the form of some religious community. And so when religion was erased from the histories and understanding of what democratic socialism has been in its various national iterations, so therefore were these people lost as well. And so you had this irony that the histories of democratic socialism, it's just this parade of white males, even though that isn't true. It isn't true to what it has been, even at its worst.
Do you think one of the questions that came in said, let me make sure I get it right. But like I was shocked to hear Gary's offhand comment about the social gospel movement being the third great awakening. And this is a minister asking the question, right? Because every American history class basically kind of almost gets to World War I, whether you're in high school, college, or wherever, and then they run out of time. So it's like our most recent history, you get the least amount of attention to. And so they go like, I would love for that to be the case. And the first two great awakenings still have reservoirs of piety, songs, liturgies, rhythms, practices that show up in American Christianity. Or if it had this type of big movement, what are the things that our current churches, members, grandparents, great-grandparents, and stuff had resonating in their bones that we can call out?
Thanks, Trip. Yes, it is absolutely the third great awakening. It has the same fundamental message as the previous two. We have fallen into corruption. We have lost our way. We don't know how to pray anymore. We've let the kind of society that's got its virtues, but also has its corrupting aspects. We've been so corrupted by the kind of quite specific kind of society that we've created, that we've just, as Scott Holland used to say, we've lost even the memory of Jesus Christ. And so the social gospel, I don't want to say all these great social gospel, I don't want to say they all have evangelical backgrounds, because there are a handful that really didn't. They're already coming out of sort of Unitarian or liberal backgrounds where evangelicalism has been lost. But well over 90% of them are so clearly radiating the language and logic of evangelicalism, but now in a context in which they've discovered that Christianity has a mission to transform the structures of society in the direction of social justice, because they've discovered there's such a thing as social structure. And if there's such a thing as social structure, then salvation can't just be individual any longer. If salvation is going to be saving, it has to be personal and social. And so that message, the third great awakening is a message about how salvation now needs to be understood with a language with which we just didn't even have before, because sociology and all this understanding of social structure and the like just didn't exist before. But we're better off for it because it actually brings us back closer to the very spirit of the gospel that talks about the principalities and powers and talks about the world in structural ways, that it's our modernism and individualism that screens it out.
Well, you both in your papers connected on something I know Helene spent a lot of work on, and a question came in on. And this is United Methodist minister who is a Claremont grad, and said, Gary and Adam, and obviously Helene, are process friendly. Now, I'm interested in how they would frame a process relational theology of liberation. Like, what are the questions or emphases you should be asking if you aren't going to let the process relational tradition, you know, be the West Coast upper middle class white progressive ideology, right? Like, and I think it's true about a lot of mainline Protestants in general, that that we have a tradition that has yet to internalize the intersectional questions of suspicion the same way we internalize suspicion around historical criticism or criticism of a tradition that's been unquestioned and that type of thing.
I'll give Adam a moment to think about this while I just say quickly. Firstly, just to mark the fact that we have people whose life work is an answer to this question, you know, shows that there is such a thing as taking utterly seriously liberationist concerns and liberationist criticism, and yet seeing the world through a Whiteheadian lens. That describes the work, you know, of Monica Coleman and Tendeka and Catherine Keller and Helene Russell and, you know, a long list of others. So it's not like we sort of lack examples of people for whom these things fuse together. Now, of course, it does so differently. I mean, it would be hard to get a sort of prophetic language of denunciation, of binary opposition, of marshaling a language about true orthodoxy, certainly the way early Jim Cone did, from a process standpoint. That's, you know, that does fall by the wayside. But everyone I've just named in some way, one way or another, will speak to this quite directly, to say, all right, here's where there are points of tension, where this nice Whiteheadian worldview maybe doesn't quite cut it by comparison to a kind of prophetic language of denunciation that you can get out of James Cone. But then also, you know, what it can also help you with is the fact that people can be oppressed and oppressors and oppressed at the same time. Whitehead can help you with that fact far more readily than you know, binary prophetic discourses that just operate, you know, in two categories.
I might talk just for a minute if I could. Adam, is that okay? Okay. I appreciate the question. And I think where I would go is actually the commonalities between liberation theology and process thought. I think one of the insights that the book that we wrote about creating women's theology, process and feminist womanist approach, is that there is a difference, however or why ever it's created, that most of the men that come to process theology have come to it through a philosophical question. I don't understand evil. How does this work? How can God be blah, blah, blah? And then the answer is, well, if we look at God in this way, we look at reality in this way, that helps answer those questions and solve some dilemmas that otherwise are cognitive dissonant. Whereas for women, typically we come to it and read something that either Whitehead has written or another process person has written and say, oh, finally, someone who's speaking a language and using words and creating a context or creating a philosophical way of thinking about the world that fits with what I've always thought and I've always felt. And I think that is where the connection can be most clear, is that the emphasis upon experience and context and contextual knowledge, and the fact that all knowledge is perspectival, and that God's truth cannot be a capital T, singular, one economy of the same, white male, straight white male, this is the answer, one savior, that it has to come from different experiences. And every liberation theology that I've read, or at least most of them, focuses on the importance of the experience of the context of those who are oppressed. What is the context of those who are oppressed and their experience? What are their resources? What do they look at? And a lot of I'll just say one more thing, a lot of the focuses on getting into more of a ancestral or tribal or indigenous religious traditions often share a lot of claims that are process-like, that we are all interconnected, that I am because I belong, that our ancestors continue to give us, we're formed by those ancestors in some way, and we continue to engage with each other in an internally related way. So I think there are lots of ways in which a process thought, theology, and liberation thought, theology, and practices can come together. Thank you.
Well,
Oh.
I'm situated in a Jesuit context.
Mhm.
So I just started reading Whitehead like about 2 years ago. So I'm still in my infancy. So I don't think in Whiteheadian categories. In a Jesuit context, the process thinker is Teilhard. So people more think about maybe omega points, right? Like where, like the direction of history and that kind of thing, which can, read as a progress or this type of linear narrative and that type of thing, but not necessarily so, but it tends to go in that direction about, but in my own thinking, this is not a well-formed thought, but in terms of what I'm struggling with, in terms of Black Lives Matters, I was thinking about Black life as a nested reality. And part of just the affirmation of reverence for life coming through the Black community, right? But what I say is that the affirmation of Black life is not, it can be seen as an end in itself, but as a generative end, meaning that it should be the entry point for looking at other forms of life, right? So we're not just talking about white supremacy, we're talking about the extinction of species itself, right? And Whitehead helps us get to that idea. That's how I got interested in process in terms of not just looking at being so anthropocentric in the sensibilities, but looking at the kind of dynamic between the social and the ecological, right? So that the affirmation of life is inclusive of both the people from below, but also the environments would actually cohere or cohabitate in and that type of thing. So that's what I was looking for in terms of like a moral base or philosophical basis for making moral claims about that. I think Whitehead kind of expands our sensibilities with that.
So this is a quick question because I think Adam's probably the appropriate person to respond to this, but it was really connected. Someone said, I'm struggling as a Black man working with it in a white dominant megachurch as a worship leader. It's becoming clear that the people around me, based on their responses to our current historical moment, are blind advocates of supremacy culture. What do I do about it? Also, I'm struggling with the fact I think I've internalized it. Can I exercise the colonialized subject?
Wow, that's tough. Without knowing the person, the context, I would say the first place to start, right, is probably in small groups, right? Like to kind of have that conversation of part of the process of liberation or even redemption is unlearning things, right? Like to talk about being a new creature, you have to unlearn the old, right? So I would maybe have a conversation or try to start some momentum in the church about what are some of the things we unlearn in order to walk this life, right? What does discipleship really mean, right? And also, what does it mean to be prophetic? If I'm talking at an individual level, I'll say mystical prophetic, right? Like in terms of, because what happens in liberationist tradition, I guess one of the dictums is obedience to God means disobedience to unjust structures, right? So faithfulness to God means being unfaithful to something. And I like the way Christopher Morris used to put it, like, what a faithful disobedience. Like, if I make an affirmation about something, what am I denying? If I say that all life, human beings have an inherent dignity, then I'm denying the fact that racism, I'm denying sexism, I'm denying all different types of phobias, right? So every affirmation comes with a denial of something, right? So he gets this from the idea of not every spirit, that you have to test the spirits, and there are some spirits that are antithetical toward life and human wholeness. So I would probably like work with that in terms of that, like what are the affirmations we're making? And in those affirmations could contain certain types of denials. And that might tease out some and hold space for ways of trying to think about ways that are not supremacist cultures, but egalitarian culture.
I think it's a great suggestion. I just told them to join our James Cone reading group because in August and September, Adam and I are reading James Cone for 2 months, and we've already got almost 600 people in the group. So I feel like, I was like, if you join the group, then you get to ask Adam questions for a while, and then you like peer pressure your coworkers. Like, don't you want to do this with
that
me?
That works too, Trip. That works too.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you guys. We have time, I think, for one more question, but this one's a doozy. So, we'll see where this goes in 5 minutes. And it picks up on what you were just saying, Adam, about the prophetic. The question is has a bit of a bite to it. And it says, the prophetic tradition retells the world in its unjust reality as if God is actually an active agent in it. Why do most white liberal Christians not believe in a God who does much of anything? And so basically the larger question is here, is it theologically viable to be a liberal progressive Christian and to also believe that God does stuff in the world? How do you think about that? Or are we essentially reduced to functional deism? So there's a lot packed into that, but you can take any direction you like. Helene, if you want to start, that would be great. If you don't want to, that's fine too.
Okay. I think God does do things in the world, but God does do things in the world through luring and persuasive power through us. And I think the more of us that come together with us, hearing the same lure, the more powerful God is in that. I get the question in the sense that, well, we're not saying, well, we can pray that God will come down and just wipe out all of coronavirus. That's not the way we think of God. That's not the way I think of God. And I think that's mostly not the way that liberal Christians think of God. But I do think that God is very effective in the world. So I'm not sure that's a great answer, but I've only got 2 minutes because everybody else needs 2 minutes. Yeah. Thanks.
Well, when I read the question, I was thinking of something similar, and having spent quite a bit of time reading Gary Dorian and always wishing he'd come on my podcast since 2008, and he's finally on something at Theocon. Like, I really feel like the tension he draws between Hegel and Kant and the way you inherit it, and then his own interpretation of process, a thought, and the way it connects to Hegel and divine action, like, is important. And when I read the question, I was just like, I basically thought I want to say this to set up Gary, because I think this is an essential question, especially for white liberal Protestantism, and it connects to James Cone's critique of white liberals who are able to doxologically perform the reality of a life-giving God, while outside the doxological context perform God's absence, and those two connection points. Anyway, that's my 30 seconds.
Well, of course, it's true that so much of liberalism has operated by a kind of logic of letting go, of just I can only stay in the church if I don't have to believe this unbelievable thing and that one too. And so you look at that trilogy I wrote, there's just less and less of a Bible in it as you run through the parade of 200 years of American liberal theologians, because the struggle with the text itself is just not rewarding to subsequent generations who've already taken for granted the lessons of the past. They're going to take for granted everything that was overthrown in the previous generations. And so, yes, you are just sort of working with a kind of logic of sort of less and less that you're trying to get something out of. That is clear. It's a clear trend line and fault and a kind of peril within the whole history of American theological liberalism and liberal Christianity per se. This is also one of the reasons that I love the personalists. I mean, my main reason is that King was a personalist, and look what he got out of it. But the whole tradition that's behind him, the personalists did not operate by the logic of subtraction. They didn't try to make it believable by emphasizing their disbeliefs and then hanging out with whatever was left. They insist that it should just make all the difference in the world. Whether you believe in God. I mean, just think what you're saying. If you say that you do, that you do believe in a divine reality, this isn't something that should just be, yeah, you do, but it doesn't really matter. It doesn't make any difference in your life or anything. It doesn't change how you look at the world. No, the personalists were just insistent on this point, and that's within the Kant versus Hegel argument that is in the whole personalist tradition. However you come out on that, we don't really want me to go off on why I'm on in the Hegel line on this question. So there is something so deeply in liberalism that takes this resort, and that is its impoverishment. However, having said that and having acknowledged it, I just need to say that an awful lot of folks who do end up becoming process theologians, it's because they needed to let go of the God who has a terrible plan for most people, and was the cause of their suffering and the suffering in their family and their pain and all of that. And they discovered there's a way of thinking theologically in which God is just relieved of all that kind of responsibility. And it's the only way they could even be Christian. Yet again, is sort of on a Whiteheadian terms that is a kind of process theodicy. That is the theodicy issue, I think, is the one that hooked so many people, and that has a way of playing out that for people from another theological perspective, they just can't see how the real Christian God is even being talked about anymore. I think the Christian God is being talked about, but it's a difficult conversation.
So, Adam, do you want to answer that question?
Well, just quickly, my sense of it is, I work with at a Jesuit school. I do work with the spiritual exercises, the Ignatian spiritual exercises, and there are a lot of people who come from white liberal churches in there. And I noticed two things. One, in terms of their God image. One is the authority of reason. Excuse me. The authority of reason has actually kind of quartered off space where the type of God of the church is not credible. And secondly, is there's this kind of culture, therapeutic culture, right? Where people are talking about feelings where there's no need for that, because you could get a certain type of sensibility or a certain type of intimacy and talk about that without an appeal to an outside reference, right? But when you do the exercises, there's an assumption that the question is not about, is there a God or isn't there a God? It's about, there's a built-in assumption that you're talking about the deepening life of God within you, right? So part of it's also about discernment, right? And I think that's where, we have to kind of sharpen our lens and really talk about discernment and create spaces where people can experience the difference between their own human emotions and a genuine type of encounter, and working with that. Because I don't think this is something that cognitively people it's going to be persuadable all the time. I think people have to feel something in their soul, right? And there's not, I think because of the structure of the worship in some white liberal churches, they don't get that type of real, I guess, primal encounter, right? And that's why you see the growth of the church is people are having primal encounters with something that they're able to have, that they claim as God. Now, how they think about it might be in very different forms, but I think that the encounter is something that precedes the way they think about it.
I just wanted to say one thing. I think God's power is in God's presence.
I just want to retweet that. I know it wasn't tweeted, but metaphorically. And with that, I just want to thank everyone for hanging out, watching the mega numbers. This is our highest retention rate and attentiveness. There are currently 287 people watching this across multiple platforms that managed to stay the whole time. And I'm just going to take it as an affirmation that I really enjoy all four of the other humans on here. Sarah convinced me to come all the way across the Atlantic Ocean to Scotland. And now whether or not I would have said yes if I'd known I was going into lockdown to spend 124 days with my 3 children, that's a different answer altogether. And we're not in a confessional. And but I mean, I've been reading Gary Dorian since I was an undergrad when he gave his Barth book and he critiqued Karl Barth. And I was like, praise the Lord, because everybody is talking to me is all up in Karl Barth's business and I find it problematic. And then they were like, you don't like that? How about Aquinas? And I was like, absolutely not. And then Helene Russell, like, is the most assigned, like her and Monica Coleman's book on process theology is the book I've assigned most at teaching in divinity students, because it is like the greatest collection of process thought, and it's all females from different locations. And then they don't like soft pedal their critique of Reinhold Niebuhr. Pause for Gary. I don't know, but like it's very direct. And and then you get Adam, who the first time we hung out, I found he was like, I listened to the podcast, and then we were like hanging out for an hour, and he goes, all right, can I tell you like 3 things that might make you uncomfortable? And then I was like, only if we get to stay friends. Right. So like all 4 of these people have been in my head for a long time. So I'm really glad everyone's hanging out and they're awesome. You should take them seriously. Check out all the stuff they've worked on. And guess what? This week, tonight, and the next 2 nights, we have live events. So you can attend. Now I know for a lot of you it's not night, because if you're in Los Angeles it's 2 p.m, but nonetheless here it's 10:35. So thank you for hanging out. Thank you for getting to meet 4 amazing people, and I hope that as you're thinking through your theological ethics, you remember this moment, check out their text, and hopefully Sarah doesn't have her baby before Wednesday's done. We have 2 more.
This is what we're moving towards.
Yeah. I mean, I know that it's uncomfortable, but I just feel like you should wait until TheoCon's done, because every child has to make space for high quality theological sophistication on the internet.
Priorities, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. It's great to see you all.
Good luck, Sarah.
Gary, bye. Good to meet you. Take care.
Great to see you, Trip. Bye. Nice to
It was
meet you.
fun.
Love you, Gary.